World War I is one of the bloodiest wars in human history. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some of the war technologies that made it so deadly. Changing warfare. World War I brought changes in many aspects of warfare, including technologies, tactics, and weaponry. New weaponry and tactics evolved as commanders desperately sought any means to get an advantage and end the fighting. Communication to and from the battle zones was achieved through telephone, Morse code, radios, and even carrier pigeon. When Allied and Central forces came to a deadlock in 1914, troops began to dig in along a 475-mile front. Initially, soldiers dug holes or took shelter in artillery craters. Eventually, these crude excavations evolved into 8-foot deep networks of trenches protected by barbed wire. Trench life was plagued with disease, lice, water, and mud. While many officers had dugout areas in which to rest, most soldiers had to sleep standing up or leaning in corners. German trenches were the most sophisticated and offered sleeping rooms, some of which had wallpaper and painted ceilings. They even brought furniture because they were there for years. They made it kind of homey. Now, the trenches on the Allied side weren't nearly as nice as the German trenches, partly because the commanders didn't want the soldiers to get comfortable there. They wanted the soldiers to think, oh, this is just a temporary space, and not let them really put up wallpaper and bring in furniture like the Germans did in their trenches. Life in the trenches. Life in the trenches consisted of long periods of monotony, interrupted only by dreary conditions, the terror of attack, the periodic raids. Opposing armies' trenches, sometimes as close as 100 feet from one another, were separated by a stretch of barren terrain known as No Man's Land. Twice a day, at dawn and at dusk, soldiers mounted a raised ledge in the trench called the fire step. They stood ready for an hour, preparing for an enemy attack. From time to time, reservists relieved frontline soldiers and brought needed supplies. British frontline troops typically served for 4 days before being relieved. Shell shock. The relentless conditions of trench warfare and fighting on the front lines resulted in a new challenge to soldiers called shell shock, or battle fatigue. Long periods of shelling and the mental stress of living in constant danger in the trenches could sometimes produce psychiatric trauma. Those afflicted usually demonstrated symptoms such as trembling, tearfulness, and damaged memory. Initially, soldiers suffered from shell shock were thought to be exhibiting cowardice, and many were executed. Treatment improved once the condition was identified, yet most veterans still ended up suffering long-term effects. The Christmas Truce, or the Joyeux Noël. On Christmas 1914, a surprising thing occurred that broke the monotony of life in the trenches. Along the lines in various places, soldiers, typically British and German troops, called unofficial truces. Enemies joined together for caroling, soccer games, conversation, and exchanging tokens of war. The truce was short-lived, however, and fighting resumed after the brief period of humanitarianism. They took a break for Christmas, then resumed the war. Scorched Earth tactics. So-called scorched earth tactics employed by both sides during World War I devastated the countryside and left civilians, especially peasants, homeless and desperate. First used by the Russians on the Eastern Front and later adopted by German troops on the Western Front, Scorched Earth involved soldiers leaving a trail of destruction as they retreated. Armies would burn buildings, ravage crops, cut down trees, and force inhabitants to flee their homes. The goal of the tactic was to leave nothing of value behind that the opposing forces might be able to use. Espionage. As in all wars, information regarding enemy plans and strategies as an invaluable asset, making espionage a part of wartime strategies. In World War I, spies would try to obtain the ciphers to enemy secret codes. Spies would also try to gain valuable information through phone tapping and interrogating prisoners on the front lines. Spying carried very real risks. Most spies captured behind enemy lines were executed. Two famous spies executed during World War I happened to be women. British nurse Edith Cavell, who was the matron of Birkendale Hospital in Brussels, helped more than 200 Allied soldiers escape. The Germans executed her for this deed. You can see a picture of her on the bottom right of this slide. The infamous Mata Hari, the real name was Margaret Zella, was a former exotic dancer who became the mistress of many key French officials during the war. She passed on many secrets she learned to Germany. However, the French discovered she was a spy and executed her. Mata Hari is the lady on the left, the exotic dancer. Weapons. The Great War saw the advent of many new weapons and technologies. Warships were designed to move more quickly and were equipped with higher quality weaponry. Improved submarine technology made it possible for vessels to conduct torpedo attacks without surfacing. Artillery became more accurate and had longer ranges. Finally, chemical weapons such as chlorine gas were widely used in war for the first time. Airplanes. The onset of the Great War saw aircraft used primarily in the area of intelligence. In an effort to combat enemy intelligence, developers began experimenting with arming airplanes. The greatest fighting spot on a plane was the nose. Dutch designer Anton Fokker interrupter allowed aircraft to have nose-mounted guns. The interrupter timed bullet flow with propeller motion, allowing bullets to pass between the blades of the plane's propellers. Bomber planes also advanced with war efforts, and modern warfare would forever be changed as battles took to the skies. Successful fighter pilots became known as flying aces. The most noted for the Germans was the Red Baron, who had 80 victories in the sky. For the British, Major Mick Manock had 73. The Red Baron liked to land his plane after shooting down an enemy and grab a souvenir. Just a fun fact. Submarines. In 1914, Britain had 75 submarines to Germany's 30. But Germany recognized the opportunity to cripple the island nation by sinking all approaching vessels, whether Allied or neutral. By February of 1917, Germany had amassed some 150 submarines for unrestricted warfare against Britain. In April 1917, 373 Allied ships succumbed to German submarine torpedoes. Although the tactic of starving out the Brits seemed to be well on its way to success, Germany's indiscriminate torpedoing of ships angered many neutral nations, such as the United States. The Lusitania. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the British steamer Lusitania off the coast of Southern Ireland. More than 1,000 civilians perished, including 128 American civilians. Eyewitnesses reported a second explosion after the initial torpedo struck. Recent research corroborates neither German claims of a secret munitions cargo nor British claims of a second torpedo. Rather, it suggests that a coal ignition may have caused the second blast. Whatever the case may be, America's anti-German sentiment flared after the tragedy of the Lusitania. The popular sentiment in favor of abandoning neutrality and entering the war started to increase. So basically, the Lusitania was the cause of war for the United States to enter. Machine guns. Two main pieces of artillery used during the war were machine guns and the Howitzer machine guns, maintained in perpetuated the deadlock of trench warfare because their rapid fire capability made it quite deadly to attempt to breach no man's land between the trenches. The British originally used the machine gun designed by Hiram Maxim called the Maxim. It was modified over the course of the war, and a version was eventually manufactured by Vickers. The German machine gunware was modeled after the Maxim also. The Howitzer. Artillery technology had also improved in World War I, resulting in the Howitzer, a long-range, large-shelled weapon. As the war went on, further improvements in the Howitzer made it more mobile. Howitzers were especially useful in bombarding enemy strongholds from long distances. Artillery launched by Howitzers would travel in high arc and drop into the enemy territory. Chemical weapons. The Great War saw wide-scale implementation of both archaic and modern weaponry and strategies. Most horrific of these strategies was the use of poison gas. The worst of the gases was chlorine. It poured from the German lines like a yellow-green cloud. Within seconds of inhaling its vapor, it destroyed the victim's respiratory organs, bringing on choking attacks. In 1917, the Germans began using mustard gas. Mustard gas, an almost odorless chemical, was distinguished by the serious blisters it caused both internally and externally, brought on several hours after exposure. The flamethrower. Another new innovation in weaponry was the flamethrower, a terrifying German weapon first used in the Battle of Verdun in 1916. Flamethrowers initially surprised and frightened French troops in the trenches. Because the weapon's limited range of about 40 yards, French soldiers soon developed counter-tactics. By targeting the flamethrower's tank, they could turn the German soldier carrying it into a ball of flames. Despite this vulnerability, the flamethrower eventually became an essential part of all armies' arsenals. Tanks. Another innovation in weaponry was the tank, developed by the British. The tank got its name because of a need for secrecy. To deceive the enemy as to the vehicle's true purpose, the British referred to the vehicle as a water carrier or water tank. Initially, the tank was unsuccessful due to mechanical problems and slow speed, which made them easy targets. The first successful tank offensive occurred at Cambrai in 1917, when more than 400 tanks were able to breach German lines. Tanks would continue to play an increasingly important role in the war, and by World War II, they had become a major weapon in modern warfare. Of course, the main use of transport was the horse. There was more horses used in World War I than tanks or vehicles, and also in World War II, there was more horses used than tanks or vehicles. Telephone and radio. The vast battlefields of the Great War created new challenges for military commanders, and communication difficulties arose. Both telephones and radios proved faulty in addressing communication needs. Telephone lines terminated at the front line, which proved problematic when armies advanced, while radios could only transmit in Morse code, broke down easily, and were very cumbersome, very difficult to move around. And the media. World War I also gave rise to the very first war films. In 1916, two cameramen filmed the battle footage from the British front line along the Somme. The edited footage, the Battle of the Somme, included staged scenes, yet the large audiences that saw it viewed it as authentic. While newspapers continued to provide the majority of the war news, many other films would be released before the end of World War I. The Zimmerman telegram. In January 1917, German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmerman sent a confidential encoded telegram intended to be relayed by the German ambassador in the U.S. to the German ambassador in Mexico. The telegram outlined a plan for a proposed alliance between Mexico and Germany against the United States. In return for allying themselves with Germany, Zimmerman promised to help Mexico, quote, reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, end quote. The British, however, intercepted the message before it reached Count von Bernstorff, the German ambassador in Washington, D.C. Hoped to convince the Americans to abandon neutrality and enter the war as an ally. The British presented the telegram to President Woodrow Wilson on February 24th. Soon afterward, the contents of the telegram became public. As a result, more and more Americans began to clamor for their country to enter the war. So if the Lusitania wasn't enough to make Americans want to fight the war, the Zimmerman telegram trying to turn Mexico against the United States was one of the last straws. As the end of this video, here are a couple discussion questions for Google Form.